Hi there, welcome to What? Series 14 and number 47. In the last verse that we looked at last week in Genesis 22 and verse 3, we see that Abraham saddled his donkey. The phrasing of that suggests that Abraham did this work himself personally. He saddled the donkey and he split the wood that he was going to take with him. Although he had plenty of servants, he chooses to do this himself, even in his old age. Perhaps this was because he was kind of filled with a nervous energy. And let's be realistic, he was kind of like a sheik, or at least a mighty person with a big bunch of people attached to his entourage. But he chose to do the menial work for God, didn't he? And reckoning that the thought process here is that there's a very, very special sacred thing that he's doing. He splits the wood, he puts things onto the animal, and it's kind of like it's an act of worship. And then he went to the place which God had told him in this wonderful kind of trusting obedience. Abraham went right to the spot which God told him. He even did this even though it would have been easier in Abram's eyes to actually do the sacrifice in the camp that they were staying at. In the next few verses, from verses 4 through to 8, we see the whole process of Abraham offering Isaac. It says in verse 4, "Then on the third day, Abram lifted his eyes and saw the place far off. Abram said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we'll come back to you.' So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, son.' And then he said, 'Look, the fire and the wood, but we don't have a lamb for the burnt offering.' And Abram said, 'My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering.' So the two of them went together." Obviously, Isaac isn't fully aware of Abraham's conversation with God. But notice it says there on the third day, Abraham came to this place. The region of Moriah is associated with Mount Moriah, which is the modern day Jerusalem. Abraham had 3 long days to think over what God had commanded him to do. This must have made the test even more severe, dwelling on it and thinking it through as they went. It says, "I will go yonder and worship." This is the first use of the word worship in reference to God in the Bible. The Hebrew word shakha simply means to bow down. And while Abraham and Isaac did not go to the mount to have a time of joyful praise, they did go to bow before the Lord. Also, it says in those verses, "And we will come back to you." I don't know whether this was just in hope or what, but Abraham was full of faith when he spoke to the young guys that went with him. He believed that both him and Isaac would come back to them. Yeah, and that's what he said to them. This doesn't mean that Abraham somehow knew that this was only a test and that God would require less of Abraham than he had said. Instead, Abraham's faith was in understanding that he should kill Isaac and God would raise him from the dead, is maybe what he thought, because God had promised Isaac would carry on the line of blessing and the covenant. You see, in that covenant, he knew that Isaac was the seed to carry on the family line, so to speak. Yet Isaac was yet to have any children. God had let him live at least long enough to have children. If Isaac had died, there would be no descendant left. and no probabilities of any other to succeed him, because you've got to remember the Abraham and Sarah situation in their old age was miraculous in itself. Yeah. You see, in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 17 to 19, it's clearly explained the concept of what God's getting at. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up, maybe even from the dead, from which he was also received in a figurative sense. You see, even into the New Testament, they use this story to explain what God's about. Abraham knew anything was possible, but it was impossible that God would break his promise. He knew God was not a liar. And to this point in biblical history, we have no record of anyone else being raised from the dead. So Abraham had no precedence for his faith apart from God's promise. Yet Abraham knew God was capable. God could do it. You see, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. You see, here what we have here is Isaac receives the wood and carries the wood that's going to burn him in this sacrifice. He took the fire in his hand and a knife. Abraham took the stuff with him to do in obedience, to do what God had told him. He didn't leave it behind or pretend to forget it. This was a further demonstration of his obedience and of his trust that if necessary, God would raise Isaac from the dead. That knife was cutting into his own heart all the time, yet he took it. Unbelief would have left the knife at home or with the young guys who travelled with them. But genuine faith takes the knife with him. The two of them went on together. There's another part of that particular passage. This means the two of them went in agreement. That's the sort of the sense of what it's been saying. Isaac did his obedience to Abraham willingly, not fully understanding, but willingly. Yeah. When he answers Isaac, in his question, he says, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Abraham knew God would provide a sacrifice, but where? Where was the lamb? That question has been asked by all the faithful. Isaac, through to Moses, through David, even through to Isaiah, and all the way through time to John the Baptist. When John the Baptist declares in John chapter 1, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. There's this concept of it there, the lamb that is provided. At this time, Abraham didn't know how God would provide. He still trusted in the ability of God to raise Isaac from the dead. That's his thought process. But he wouldn't stop trusting God because he didn't know how God would fulfill the promise. There's an element of interest in what's going on here. He's going, now, how God's going to do this? Sometimes in our lives, we have to ask the question, how is God going to do this? We have a remarkable picture of the work of Jesus and the concept of what Jesus did thousands of years before it happened. The Son of Promise willingly went to be sacrificed in obedience to his Father, carrying the wood for his own sacrifice, just as Isaac did, all with the full confidence of the promise of resurrection. Let's leave it there for this week.